Developing and preparing resources for education and training. This is a short film in support of the Diploma in Education and Training. The two books shown on this slide are highly recommended in support of this subject generally, and also form some or all of the source material in this and other films relating to this course. So as I say, in this film we're going to be talking about how to develop and prepare resources for your training and delivery. And we're going to look at planning inclusive learning in your schemes of work and lesson plan. We're going to look at identifying session aims, content, resources, assessment criteria and so on. And that by knowing your learners you can plan the above to include everyone and take account of differences to help all learners participate in the lesson and achieve their aims. So what we're basically saying is when you come to develop and prepare the resources for your training is that you do it again from a broad approach to start off with, and then you narrow it down into the resources that you would need for each session. But to do that you need to think inclusively. You need to understand what your session aims and content and resources and assessment criteria are, and also knowing who your learners are. You know, do they want a workbook? Will they want individual resource sheets? Will they want it electronic? And all these kind of questions that we could ask ourselves about how we plan, develop and prepare our resources. But just to summarize what we've just said really again, in the sense that when you come to develop and prepare resources, that you start with a broader thought of your plan, of being inclusive, of knowing your schemes of work, of knowing what your sessions aims are and all those things first, so that when you're thinking about preparing your resources you do it with that bigger, broader context in mind first. So when developing and preparing your resources, you want to justify your choices for the resources that you use by sort of thinking about and then through that confirming the methods that you've chosen in relation to perhaps different learning styles or different teaching styles. So, you know, if you've got a broad mix of learners, then you're going to want to make sure that your learning resources cover visual, auditory and kinesthetic ways of accessing information and preferences to learning. You'll also be thinking perhaps whether you are delivering a learner-centered style with lots of listening and discussion. Again, what resources are going to stimulate that and so on. You need to match information about your learners to plan how the content is delivered. So once you know what behaviours they bring and what skill levels and knowledge levels they come to the course with, again that will inform how you think about the resources you develop and the resources that you prepare for your training sessions. So think about identifying specific learner needs and plan resources to meet them. So again, if a lot of the course is about discovery and exploring information, perhaps brainstorming information that they already know and so on, maybe you need resources that allow them to capture that information and write it down. If that information they write down is going to be used for an assignment or used for a practical application, then again, how do you want them to capture that in order to be able to use it? So again, thinking of specific needs within the kind of course that you're doing and how it's delivered could be very, very important. In addition, if a learner has a slight visual impairment, for example, you may want to provide handouts in a suitable font or in, perhaps with different coloured backgrounds and so on, again to help people be able to access information. So again, when you're thinking about your resources, if you understand what your learners' needs are at the beginning of the course, there may be some specifics you need to address right at the start, and maybe amending your resources into suitable fonts and perhaps coloured papers to support that might be also part of consideration. So you can make your lessons and your resources inclusive by using differentiation really as a way of thinking about putting the resources together. So your learning outcomes, you might have varied tasks to achieve those, and you might have different specific learning plan targets for each learners to meet those outcomes. Not all learners, and certainly this would be the case on work-based learning programs, not all learners would necessarily work at the same speed through the program, and so you may therefore vary the targets of when people will achieve certain things. With some more type commercial open courses where it's very strict, of course that might not be possible. The activity aspect of the lesson will mean that you need to perhaps consider balancing visual, auditory, and kinesthetic aspects of accessing information and changing the complexity of tasks to suit learners. So, again, you might be considering, well, here's a base task that I get the whole group to do, but what I need to do is perhaps have sort of extension tasks or addition tasks, so that if some learners achieve that task more quickly, there's something else that I can extend that task to keep them busy while everybody else does the core task. And of course, again, when it comes to resources, then you might then want to consider different types of fonts, different color paper, whether paper-based resources is actually what you need, or whether you want online resources, people access them through their phones and tablets and so on. So again, there's a lot to consider when you think about those resources, but also if you are trying to balance visual, auditory, kinesthetic, if you are thinking about extension tasks and so on to core tasks, then it starts to trigger in your mind, well, how would I deliver that? How would I provide that to the learners? And then also the teaching style that you're using. So, how you communicate, what different methods are you going to do? Presentations? Are you going to do workshops? Are you going to do discussions? Are you going to do games? All the different ways that you're going to deliver the information. It might be about the language you use. You might have to use quite technical language, or you might be talking about a technical subject but need to break it down into much more simple language. So that might certainly drive how you consider writing resources or provide resources to learners. And also changing the room setup and the chair position of people might also have an impact on how they receive information. So very often in organizations, in formal training situations, you'll have the room set up in a sort of a boardroom style, where everybody's kind of sat next to each other around a U-shaped table for it, perhaps. And maybe to help break down that barrier, you move it so that everybody's sitting more around individual tables in groups of fours, and that may give you a more workshop style. Again, depends on the context of what you're doing. For assessment, you might need to vary your assessment methods to suit learner needs. So it might be, if certain learners have a challenge writing answers to written questions, that you provide the opportunity for them to answer questions orally, and you record it on a digital voice recorder to replace the need to write written answers out. And also providing various options in terms of support. So whether that's professional referral support, because the needs of a particular individual might be outside of your needs. So if somebody needs specialist help on sort of core skills such as numeracy, literacy, or ICT and so on, maybe that gets referred. Maybe you can offer one-to-one sessions, or maybe there's the opportunity to have peer support sessions. But again, you can differentiate that and make lessons more inclusive by offering those different ways of supporting. So certainly, just to summarize what we've just really been through, is that whole idea of, if you're now thinking about how to develop and prepare the resources for your session, there's different aspects of the lesson will have a different impact on the resources you need. And so when you think about all those different aspects of the lessons and how you might differentiate them, then that may well have an impact on the final resources that you deliver into a particular training session or teaching session. Now, one of the tools that we can use is Bloom's taxonomy to help us understand how to plan and prepare resources. In this series of films, there is a film specifically covering taxonomies of learning, and if you haven't seen that yet, it might be useful to go back and watch that. But the bottom line is, in terms of Bloom taxonomy, it classifies learning into three categories. The first category being thinking skills, or what we would call cognitive skills, so the ability to know stuff, understand it, apply it, analyze it, and so on, and sort of process information, so the ability to gradually think more deeply. We also have the affective taxonomy, or the affective domain of learning, which is all about attitudes and values. And so as we become better, as we learn information, we might actually integrate it into the way we do things normally, and it becomes part of what we normally do. It becomes part of our value system. Very much about attitude and the why we should do something. And then finally, the other sort of domain of learning is the psychomotor domain, which is very much practical and physical skills, being able to do something, whether that's perhaps bake a cake or change a car tire, for example. But it's much more practical skill based learning. And so just to kind of summarize that, so when we're talking about planning resources, are we talking about resources we need that encourage thinking? Are we talking about resources we need that encourage development of attitude and values? Do we need resources that help people develop their practical and physical skills? Of course, that depends a lot on the course that you're teaching and the context of the subject matter, but some courses may need you to work across all those domains. Now, interestingly, Bloom then subdivides the three categories into low order and high order skills. And this is basically saying that there are skills within each category that are the start point, and then as we become more proficient in that category, we develop those skills and we become able to do more with, for example, knowledge. So we might know stuff, like we might be able to list a list of information. We might be able to provide a list of information, but to analyze that would require us to use a higher order skill. So we'll get into that in a moment. So lower order skills are stored in the short-term memory, and we can tend to record the information but not necessarily apply it to any other context. So you might be able to remember the name of some of the top football teams in the Premiership, for example. You might not be able to, which is totally fair enough. But if you can, you might just be able to remember Liverpool, Manchester United, Manchester City, Aston Villa, who aren't in the Premiership anymore. But you can list those names, but you might not necessarily be able to apply them to another context, but you can certainly recall names of well-known football teams, for example. But higher order skills is where somebody fully understands the facts and can apply it in different contexts. So, you might not only just be able to identify teams, but you might understand who they are, where they are. You might understand what division they're in, whether they're doing well or not, and why, and whether they're doing well or not. You may be able to analyse why they may or may not be doing well. You may be able to come up ways in which you think they might be able to improve, which takes you even further into the sort of the cognitive domain. So that's what we would mean by higher order skills. And by using Bloom's structure to plan your lessons and tasks in a phased way, you can lead to high order skills being achieved by your learners and differentiated tasks. So if we start at lower order and we build on top of that, then we can lead people to be able to do more with whatever it is that they're learning. So let's have a look at this in a sort of a diagrammatical table sense. So, as this diagram shows, with the sort of lower levels in terms of cognitive learning and understanding, at the lower levels we're talking about knowledge. And in the example I've just given, where we can list, name or recognise certain things, and the example here is list health and safety procedures, or we might be able to list certain people in certain positions' names, or as I said a moment ago, certain football teams. But you basically can list, name and recognise, and that is seen as kind of the beginning point, if you like, of this taxonomy. But as you can see, as we move through comprehension, which is now we can explain and describe what those items are, we then are able to apply them and solve problems with them, and then it moves on to analysis, where we can examine in more detail, compare, contrast, understand the relationships. We can then synthesize, which means to summarize and explain, and even perhaps come up with slightly new ways of doing things. And then evaluate would be to be critical, to see the merits and faults, come up with a conclusion, and even to make recommendations. So evaluating, as it says in the bottom right hand corner there, how effective your procedures are. So you get a sense that working through this taxonomy, from knowledge through to application, analysis, synthesis and evaluation, it gets harder and requires more deeper thinking. And so to that extent, if you're building resources around whether people need to be able to just know something, or whether they need to be able to apply it, or whether they need to be able to analyze it or evaluate it, certainly that will have an influence on the type of resources that you might put together for them. A lot of qualifications these days use words like know, understand, analyze, evaluate, review, apply as sort of command verbs to drive performance criteria. And so obviously, if you've got performance criteria that is asking learners to analyze something, before they can get to analysis, they have to be able to know what it is they're talking about, comprehend it, have some idea of how it's applied. At that point, then they can perhaps start to compare, contrast and understand relationships and so on. So you can see how also those different levels from low to high within the taxonomy build on each other. And that's cognitive domain, and that's very common, used in lots and lots of training. Now, the affective taxonomy, if you like, or the domain works slightly differently, except that but rather than a higher level of understanding, perhaps it's more of a deeper level of internal integration, which gets us through the taxonomy. So a lot of courses are about people understanding the why they do things, and the why they do it, and knowing why they do it, and therefore about attitude and how they do things. And so we go from low levels to high levels, from receiving information to be able to respond to information, to actually valuing that information and understanding it so much that you can explain it, debate it, argue about it, to be able to organize that information internally, but to a point where actually you display those practices automatically internally. You behave along the lines of that attitude. From a health and safety perspective, which is quite a nice example to use in terms of the effective domain, is that yes, you could be told about health and safety procedures and you could receive that information, which is a low level. You might respond to that information and say, yes, I understand. If I got this quite right, yes, that's fine, I understand it. You might then have a little bit more of once you've taken it on board, you might be able to debate it a little bit more, to the point where you can perhaps modify how you feel about it, to the point where eventually you integrate that information so that it's an automatic behavior. So if at the beginning you were receiving information on a health and safety checklist or a health and safety risk assessment procedure that you are to follow, in the beginning you're just receiving, responding it, and you're taking it on, you're building it into what you do. But ultimately the higher end of this is that you do it automatically because you believe it's important, you understand why you do it, and you do it because it's part of your sort of value process, and you just display it. That's how you work. So it's an interesting one. Attitude is an important piece of the jigsaw, if you like. And then psychomotor, which is the next one, which is all about physical and basically physical and practical skills. Again, starts from a low level to a high level. Now, low level imitation is where you might see somebody do something and you try and copy it. And a good example might be, for example, going on a first aid course, and the tutor at the front shows you how to do CPR on a dummy. So you watch them do it, and then you have a go. So you're basically imitating. You're trying to repeat and copy what it is you've just seen. The next stage is manipulation, where maybe you get some instructions. So now you're having a go, but you're receiving instruction from somebody to try and improve your skills and help you get it right. The next step is where you can do it. You can demonstrate that you can do it on your own. You're now able to administer CPR on the dummy on your own and deal with that. The next step, which is articulation, is where you can go on and sort of make your own decisions about it, but also you're beginning to modify your approach because you can take on other practical skills at the same time, and appreciate that maybe in an emergency situation you might be giving CPR, but there might be other things you need to do. There may be other people injured, there may be other people in the room having an effect on what's going on, to the point where you get to naturalization, where yes, you can do a lot with what you understand, but not only that, you can also manage other events as they happen around you. And so it all becomes second nature, but it's not just the one thing you can do now. Perhaps it's lots of things within that task that you can do at the same time, because you've gained a level of physical mastery over what you're doing, to the point where you can do that and do other things at the same time. So you get a sense again with psychomotor and doing things physically. You might start off from a point of view where you're trying to copy what somebody's doing and you're not doing too badly. Then eventually you get some more instruction to the point where you can do it, and I can show you I can do it, and then you can do more with it, which is your articulation and your naturalization aspects of the psychomotor domain of learning. So taking all this on board, the idea then is that you apply these theories to your resources to create differentiated tasks for learners, for different tasks, for different parts of the course that you're trying to do. And it might be that for some groups you do a certain type of resource, and for other groups you do another type. But the idea is, once you understand about differentiation and you understand about the different domains of learning and working your resources across those domains, then when you're developing your resources, you'll understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to capture or what you're trying to recreate in the classroom or wherever it might be, and so you'll create the resources based around that. Now, for example, the outcome of a particular training might be understand policies and procedures at work to deal with customer complaints. Now, of course, depending on what you're doing in the classroom, each learner might be at different levels. And some might need to start at low order skills and some may be at high level skills. Now, this does happen often in learning and training these days, is that people bring their current behaviours and knowledge levels with them, and you go around the room and you find out what everybody currently knows about a subject matter. And if they're all on a customer service course, for example, you may have somebody who knows their policies and procedures very, very well in terms of handling customer complaints, and you may have other people in the room who've never had to handle a complaint because they might be less senior. So yes, that then does pull on your skills to be able to manage those different levels of knowledge within the classroom, and your resources again will want to reflect that. So, as it says here, for example, you might want to use a handout as a resource on customer complaints policies. And you could then differentiate this resource. You could modify it to cater for low to high order skills in relation to cognitive category as it is theory based. So what you might have is for people who already know what the organisation's customer complaints policies are, you might have a handout that has bits missing and you want them to fill the gaps and you want them to try and work out what's missing and understand what's there. Whereas for people perhaps with low order skills at that point, you give them perhaps a bit more of a complete policy and you ask them to answer questions about it so that you get them to understand it first. The other group who are filling in the gaps of the missing bits already understand it, but you're testing their knowledge that they do really understand it, but they are coming from a place where they know a little bit more about it. So you get a sense of how you can certainly differentiate a simple resource as a handout for different people at different stages within the group. So here we're talking about, well, what's the benefits of doing this? Why go through the process of really working hard to make sure resources meet the needs of your people? Well, the benefits clearly are that you're trying to get everybody to learn, and everybody brings what they bring to the classroom, and you're trying to meet those individual needs and those individual preferences. And so whether you're trying to get through people through their visual, auditory or kinesthetic channels, whether you've got people who are more reflective or more activist who like to have a go, or whether they like to step back and reflect a little bit more, or whether people want to get involved and have a go physically at something, or whether people want to know and understand things. You've got a sense of where people are at and how, what you might put into your resources. You're trying to get learners to reach their own maximum potential, and so if you get the start point right, you will build them in the right direction, which allows for individual progress, keeps them engaged because you're working on them at the level that they are comfortable with that. It provides a variety of activities anyway, which keeps everybody interested and engaged, creates fun and interesting lessons, and allows for a broader participation across the people within your lesson or within your group or within your class. Now there are some limitations though, and there are to create resources, and especially to create resources at the kind of level we've been talking about here, is time consuming, and you need to have the time to write the resources to create them. That time can be expensive, and also the levels of modification, you might need some help on it from other more expert members of the team, which can be challenging, and you may just not have the resources available all the time, or even for some people the ability to use ICT to the level where you can create the resources you want to create. And again, you might need help to do that. So there are some limitations, but I think it's certainly with any teacher or trainer's own best interest, as sort of as part of their own development, is to, as far as possible, develop their ICT skills so that they can, use tables, create documents and things like that, create PowerPoint slides and so on, that offer, as broad as possible, the opportunity to use different types of resources in different types of situations. Now, in terms of the minimum core of literacy, language, numeracy and ICT, again, we've been there is another film that specifically addresses the whole minimum core skills, and we're talking, as I say, about literacy, language, numeracy, and ICT. And this will need to be planned into your teaching and delivery. And so, to that point, you might decide to embed it within the main qualification, or depending on what you're doing and the context you're in, you might keep it separate. But both approaches are recognised, but you will also need to make your resources inclusive. So if you're trying to cover some core aspects within your course and your training, then you want to build that into your resources, so yet it's another area to consider. And especially if you're wanting people to improve their writing skills, for example, you might create blank worksheets where they can write their own definitions of subjects, or they can capture certain things that are being said or observe things and make notes and so on, just as a quick example. But again, thinking about how you build literacy, language, numeracy and ICT into the course, again, that can be very much supported by the types of resources that you create. Now, this can raise challenges, as often learners have different levels of competencies in relation to minimum core before they started a course and at an initial assessment stage. Of course, that often, especially in adult learning, an open course, commercial course adult learning can be a real challenge to a trainer or a tutor, because yes, you've got people in the room, some who may have been not involved in education or academic studies or anything like that for a very long time, and some who have, and so you may well find yourself explaining concepts or doing knowledge or offering theories or doing activities where some people in the room have got it like that, and where you've then got to provide support and the right resources to help those others not miss out on their part of the learning. And so, part of your role again as a teacher, trainer, tutor is to understand the group in front of you early on in the course, so that you can make those modifications on the hoof, as it were, if you absolutely need to. So as we've said, apply Bloom's theories and look at taxonomies of learning when planning lessons. Consider visual, auditory, kinesthetic and other sort of preferences of learning, and also cover that minimum core to try and help you create inclusive learning environments, but also inclusive resources that can help your learners to discover this topic that you're trying to deliver, and to learn it for themselves in a way that is comfortable for them. So finally, putting this theory into practice. So the idea is that you're able to use resources in delivery that are inclusive learning and teaching approaches. And also, and this is at the final sort of piece of the jigsaw really, is once you've had a go at using some resources that you've created, that you evaluate those resources again in line of whether they were inclusive and whether they were effective and did they work. And of course, getting that feedback about resources can be very useful, because then it can allow you to further develop them in the future and make them better for future classes.